Okay, I would like to bring your attention to a video called When Tommy Met Mo. I don't think that's the exact title, but regardless, I've put a link to the video under my video anyway. It's a documentary and it's really worth checking out. I think it's very good insight into a lot of the debate that is going on in Britain today regarding both Islamism and the far right. Um, and it concerns Tommy Robinson, who was the founder of the group, the English Defence League, which is a very controversial organisation. And it is about his journey, if you like, with a man called Mo Ansar, who's a Muslim man who wanted the EDL banned. And it sort of shows the debates they have, completely polar opposite views on many things. Um, and it's just a very interesting documentary. Um, for me, this is particularly relevant at this time. The documentary's maybe from about a year ago, but I think it's very relevant. So a little bit about the EDL, if you're not familiar. The EDL describe themselves as an anti-Islamist organisation, and they say they're anti-racist. Um, and they have made attempts to try and show that they're not racist by having, for example, I believe they've had Sikh and Jewish members. But on the surface, the EDL basically has an image of a far right organisation. An organisation that is. I mean, I have to say, I've never got a good vibe from them, and I've been in not personal contact with them, but I have seen the EDL people here. Um, and the image is basically they come across like football hooligans, quite frankly. Um, their their approach is aggressive, loud, very vocal, and a lot of it is built on sweeping sort of statements. I think Tommy Robinson himself is an interesting man, and I would urge anybody to watch this documentary. One thing I don't like is that those who don't like the EDL, and I'm no fan of the EDL, but I mean those who really don't like the EDL, like those. I'm specifically thinking about Unite Against Fascism, and I'll come to my views on that organisation in a minute, but their stance is basically the EDL is full of horrible neo-Nazis. That's basically the caricature they have. And you can see that in the sort of literature they have on their website. I think that's obviously I don't know Tommy Robinson personally, but he strikes me as quite an interesting man. And I have to say this, I have respect for anybody who's prepared to put themselves into an alien environment. Now what I mean by that is wherever you think of Tommy Robinson, it did take a certain level of courage to do what he done in that documentary, which was to step into an environment that clearly makes him uneasy. And for his part, the Muslim man Mo Assad also had some courage in meeting with Tommy Robinson, who is the public face of a far right, or was the public face of a far right organisation. The documentary closes whereby Tommy Robinson leaves the EDL and joins the Quilliam Foundation, which is not exactly an organisation that his, let's say, travelling companion is part of. But I don't want to make it too complicated. Watch the documentary yourself. I strongly recommend it. Um, I think the EDL is partly to blame for its own bad image because of the way they behave. I mean, if you're going down the street carrying glasses of beer, um, waving flags, topless, yelling it to the top of your lungs, um, EDL, that is intimidating, and it's designed to be intimidating. It's all about power. Um, so it looks like, I'm not saying they are, but image is significant, and they come across as looking like a bunch of rowdy football hooligans. Now, Tommy Robinson himself, Tommy Robinson has been at pains to stress that he doesn't think that EDL is a racist organisation, and at a few of his rallies he has even said that to his supporters. But the problem is, far-right organisations have always done this. They've always tried to improve their image. I mean, the Front National in France, under Marine Le Pen, they've tried that as well. I don't entirely trust the EDL. I don't think they are everything that they claim to be. I don't entirely trust them. But, and this is a very significant factor, I think, just because they happen to be quite an unpleasant organisation and some of the tactics they use are highly questionable, and they definitely have unsavoury characters, which Tommy Robinson acknowledged himself, it doesn't mean that everything they're saying is wrong. And this is something I know will be very controversial, because if anyone says anything sympathetic to the EDL, then the response would be, oh, you're sympathetic, you must be a member. I'm not a member, just to be clear, I'm not a member of the EDL. But what they are basically saying, that there is a threat in this country from radical Islam, is a fact. It's simply a fact. And quite frankly, there's mainstream politicians say the same thing, but in a much more diplomatic manner. The only difference really is that the EDL are not professional politicians and they're not particularly diplomatic. That's, well, I shouldn't say that's the only difference. There are quite a number of other differences. A very large faction of the EDL doesn't seem to differentiate between Muslims and Islamists, and I think that is one of their biggest flaws. Having said that, and I don't want to give too much away about the documentary because it is worth watching, but one thing in my opinion that I was disappointed by was that the Muslim man, on one hand, he came across as very reasonable. He wasn't like ranting, he wasn't trying to force his views on Tommy Robinson, but he was coming from quite a defensive platform, and I think throughout the documentary Tommy Robinson was willing to give more ground than the Muslim guy was. Now what I mean by that is whenever Tommy Robinson tried to raise an issue about Islamism, the Muslim guy just made excuses and just say, oh, it's nothing to do with Islam. And this is precisely the problem that I've been talking about, and I do think it's a huge problem. Now there are an increasing number of British Muslims who recognise this as a problem, and they are saying, no, this is not helpful. Because, I mean, obviously, it's flawed to talk about the Muslim community like it's one community. But when individual Muslims say things like, it's not the fault of Islam, that is just plain wrong. It's just ignorant. Islamists, and I've argued this time and time again, they may distort the Quran, they may distort Islam, but they come from Islam. And what Tommy Robinson found is that he actually found himself in agreement at several points with some of the Muslims he encountered. One of them was Salma Yaqub, who's a former leader of the Respect Party. She's a Muslim woman, and that particular segment was about women's dress code. She actually found that she was on the same page, ironically, with Tommy Robinson, insofar as young Muslim girls shouldn't be compelled to wear the hijab. It's something for adult women to decide. So there were a few surprising points in the documentary. It was a very interesting documentary. There were inevitably quite a few tense moments as well, when they found that they were just polar opposites and they just weren't agreeing. I think it took a certain degree of courage from both sides. The Muslim guy attended an EDL march. Now, that certainly takes courage. If I was a Muslim, I would be intimidated going down an EDL march. It doesn't matter if they say, oh, we're not against all Muslims and we're not racist. They have to understand they come across as a rowdy street gang. That's how they come across. Now, Tommy Robinson has said the organisation needs reformed. What he ultimately done was left it. So he obviously felt strongly enough that he felt he had to leave it. And I think that took a huge amount of personal courage. It's almost like, I know it's not an exact analogy, but Malcolm X, for example, later on in life he said that the Nation of Islam was too extreme in, for example, blaming all white people for white racism. So I always respect people who come out of a movement or recognise the flaws of the movement, and I think it's slightly unfortunate. There's something in human nature, and I remember when Tommy Robinson left the EDL, a lot of Muslims on the group that I often comment on were very cynical, and they said, oh, he's once a fascist, always a fascist, and this sort of thing. I think that's very sad. It's a very unforgiving, cold sort of attitude, and it's very cynical. It's sort of like the idea that people never change. Now, I don't actually believe that Tommy Robinson is a fascist, and at this point, I want to take issue with. I think he was wrong in the approach that he took, and definitely, like I say, I'm very uneasy with the EDL as an organisation. I don't think that Tommy Robinson is an evil man, not for 1 second. I think he is an angry young man who saw problems in society and he wanted to speak out against it, so he formed this organisation. The problem is it attracted people who probably were former neo-Nazis, um, and without doubt it's an organisation that has a bad image, and I do believe they're partly responsible for that bad image. You know, I remember being in debate with an EDL member once about this, and I said, okay, how do you think that comes across? And they said, oh well, it's just for high spirits. This whole thing about the chanting and, you know, carrying beer and so on. That does not come across as a responsible organisation. Anyway, sorry, I'm not structuring this video very well, but there is a lot to talk about. Just a few words about Unite Against Fascism. It's an organisation I've been familiar with for a while. Not long ago, just before I watched this documentary, I watched this little segment of, Tommy Robinson speaking at the Oxford Union. Of course, there were protests outside. It reminds me of when Nick Griffin spoke on Question Time. They were saying, oh, he's a fascist, the Oxford Union shouldn't be given a fascist a platform, etc., etc. Now, there's something about the far left that really, really, really pisses me off, and I do consider Unite Against Fascism a far left organisation, and that is their utter intolerance to other opinions, which actually is a lot more fascist than Tommy Robinson. And just to be clear, I'm not Tommy Robinson. I don't agree with everything he says, and I don't like all the approaches he takes. But if we're going to have a situation when someone is going to be jeered and physically attacked in some cases, and have eggs thrown at them and shouted down because people don't like their opinions, that's an affront to democracy. It's the same as when Nigel Farage was attacked in Edinburgh. And quite frankly, there is a hardcore element on the far left that are just as thuggish as the far right. And I'm sick of them. There was a while back when they kept demanding that the EDL be banned. Well, what happened was 5 London boroughs did ban the EDL, but they also banned Unite Against Fascism. Then, of course, Unite Against Fascism had a tantrum. But that just shows that they don't practice what they preach. In other words, they want the freedom to have their views, but they want to deny that to other people. Now, they will say an organisation like the EDL is a fascist organisation. I think it's a far right organisation. Fascist is a loaded term. No doubt there will be fascist elements within the EDL. I've no doubt about that. But when they say, for example, the EDL shouldn't be allowed a platform because in their view it's a fascist organisation, well, I'm sure you can find plenty of communists within the UAF. And quite frankly, it comes across to me as an apologist organisation. I looked at their Facebook page, just to be fair, so that I wouldn't talk about them without having some basis for doing so. Now, their Facebook page, the last 10 posts, 9 out of 10 of the last 10 posts is about Islamophobia and racism. Now, just to be clear, I don't mind them reporting those problems, because unfortunately there are racist attacks on people. There was a man in Wales killed, an Asian man, and there have been racist attacks in Germany, and they're connected to this movement Pegida, which is an anti-Islamic movement, I suppose the German equivalent of the EDL in a sense, and it's been quite vocal in recent weeks. But what they're saying basically is, we can have our view, but we're going to demonise anyone with a different view and try and shout them down. Now, to me, that is the very epitome of fascism. If we have an understanding in this country of freedom of expression, that has to apply to everybody. Everybody. The barrier, and I made a video about this, is, to me, advocating violence. So if the EDL advocates violence against Muslims, yeah, they should be censored and they should face consequences. If Islamists advocate violence, they should face consequences. But the UAF, Unite Against Fascism, are complete hypocrites. And this is why. They focus on one form of fascism and completely ignore another. The thing that I cannot stand about the United Against Fascism organisation is that they talk about combating extremism, but they utterly disregard Islamism. They had one response to the attacks in Paris. They said predictably, "Oh, we condemn this. It's terrible." The attackers say they're acting in the name of Islam, and then the rest of the paragraph is, "We must combat Islamophobia. We must combat racism." So basically, they're trying to sweep it under the carpet. They're denying what is simply a reality, and that is what I cannot stomach about Unite Against Fascism. If they were protesting against the EDL and Islamists, I'd have a lot more respect for them. But the fact that they only protest against the EDL and turn a blind eye to Islamism, to me it makes them utter hypocrites. And I'd go so far as to suggest that some of them are basically just apologists. They may condemn terrorist attacks, but if they're ignoring the ideology that is fueling those attacks, then they're just utter hypocrites. So I have no time at all for Unite Against Fascism. I think you can oppose fascism without joining an organisation like that. And it's not a peaceful organisation. They have violently attacked their political opponents. Now granted, the EDL is not a peaceful organisation either. Personally, I think it's two sides of the same coin. I think it's basically a case of the far right versus the far left, and I've not much time for either. I think there are a lot of people in the EDL, no matter what Tommy Robinson says, that basically do have a problem with all Muslims. And, you know, they wouldn't say it on camera in a documentary like that, but you just need to look at some of the comments from EDL people online. It gives you an idea of the sort of mentality. So I have no doubt it is a far-right organisation, and I want nothing to do with them. But I don't think there's an inconsistency in not wanting to be connected with a group like that, but still speaking out and saying, yes, Islamism is a problem. Now, in the documentary, one problem I found was the Muslim guy wasn't really, and I am pleased at one point, someone from the Quillian Foundation actually challenged him on this. He said, well, wait a second, how have you evolved? You know, you're expecting Tommy Robinson to change, but how are you changing in terms of your views? And he wasn't ceding any ground. Now, to be fair, this guy wasn't an Islamist. He was I guess you could say, a moderate Muslim. He was a normal sort of person. He came across as reasonable, polite, but like far too many Muslims, he was in denial. And I'm afraid this is a very big problem. A very big problem. For example, they brought up the issue of Asian grooming gangs. That's been a big problem in Northern England that has been exposed in recent years. Now, one of the reasons that wasn't tackled completely was because officials and the police feared being branded racist. Now, when this issue was brought up, the guy didn't really address that point. He sort of tried to deflect, like, oh, would you say that all white people are paedophiles? But he was deflecting from the point that in these cases, it was overwhelmingly young Asian men. Well, Asian men, specifically Pakistani men. Now, he was refuting that it was anything to do with Islam, and I don't know if it was to do with Islam or not. I think more likely not on this occasion. But nevertheless, when there's a problem within a community, and I am aware that not all Muslims are the same, I know it's difficult to talk on those terms, but let's say within the British Muslim population, there's a huge amount of denial and defensiveness. Now, on one hand, this is understandable, because it's human nature. Most people get defensive if they feel they are under attack. But that's not an excuse for responsible adults to deflect from honest debate and honesty. And honesty, for example, in that situation, was that there were many young British girls, young white British girls, targeted by Asian gangs. This is just the way it was. I should say specifically Pakistani gangs. Asian is, shouldn't say that. Now, the problem I have with a group like Unite Against Fascism is anybody who tries to raise these issues, they will automatically brand a racist bigot. And that frankly makes me furious, that they could be so close-minded and so reactionary and so thoroughly stupid to turn a blind eye to these problems I just, it really irks me off, and I don't think mainstream politicians should have anything to do with Unite Against Fascism. By all means, they should enact legislation against hate crime and condemn racism and condemn. Regarding Islamophobia, I prefer to say anti-Muslim prejudice because I think Islamophobia is a flawed term. A phobia is an irrational fear. If people are frightened of all Muslims, that's irrational. But there's nothing irrational about being concerned about radical Islam. Now, the sort of mentality you have in Unite Against Fascism, I don't even know, and I don't care quite frankly, if they would interpret this video I'm making right now. They would turn around and say, "Oh, you're in the EDL, you're a Nazi, you're a racist." No, I'm not. Pardon me. Anyway, I've covered more or less all the areas I want to cover, but basically, there needs to be a lot more honesty all around. Organisations like the EDL need to calm down a little bit and realise that there is not some massive Muslim conspiracy to take over the West. Yes, there are dangerous individualismist groups, and there's nothing wrong with taking issue with those groups. But the problem is the EDL, no matter what they say, they come across as being against all Muslims. So when they're accused of racism and fascism, that's where it comes from. And they need to understand the image they have. Now, they may think that they're martyrs of free speech and being against political correctness and so on, but they need to, if they want to get wider support, they need to understand how they come across. British Muslims, for their part, need to appreciate that need to be honest, quite frankly, that there are problems within Islam. And there was a very important point raised in the documentary, and the Quilliam Foundation supports this, the Muslim guy doesn't, and that is that the more extreme surahs in the Quran should be reformed and challenged. That's something that isn't happening. There was a scholar, I'm not sure what his exact position was, but he made this point that because the Holy Quran is based on ancient scriptures, and basically it hasn't been changed in 1,400 years, as far as I know, the standard Quran has never been updated. So they're saying you need to look at the context of the time, because at that time, for example, it was liberating for women and so on. But context in this historical sense makes no difference if that is being interpreted in today's world. So I think it was reasonable that Tommy Robinson would interpret it a certain way because he was using a certain surah. I forget the name of it, but watch the documentary, you'll see it. Where he was saying, look, this is saying that girls should be slaves. And the two Muslim guys were getting very defensive and saying, no, you're misinterpreting it. But this whole business about misinterpreting, well, how are you meant to interpret that? And watch the documentary. I forget the exact surah, but if you watch it, you'll know the point I mean. Anyway, I've talked for a long time here, but please do watch the video. If you don't even watch my video, watch that one because it's very interesting. And a final disclaimer, I've already said this, but I'm not a member of the EDL, I'm obviously not a member of UAF, and I'm not a Muslim, so I'm completely out of the circle of the things that I'm talking about. Okay, thank you.